At 3 in the morning, while most of the country slept, El Salvador made a decision no nation had ever made before. It didn't launch a pilot program or test a sandbox. It didn't quietly experiment behind closed doors. It declared Bitcoin legal money, not as a novelty, not as a tech demo, as real currency. Overnight, a small Central American country challenged how the global financial system was supposed to work. The world's reaction was instant and brutal. Economists mocked it. Media outlets called it reckless. Financial institutions warned of collapse. The story became simple and comfortable. A risky crypto gamble by an attention-seeking leader that would end in disaster. But what most people never followed was what happened after the headlines moved on, because the outcome wasn't what the world expected. This matters now because El Salvador wasn't really betting on Bitcoin. It was testing something much bigger, whether a small country trapped inside the modern financial system had any room left to maneuver. To understand that, you have to understand where El Salvador started. For decades, El Salvador didn't control its own money. In 2001, it gave up its currency and fully adopted the US dollar. That brought stability, but it also came with invisible handcuffs. No control over interest rates, no ability to print money in emergencies, no way to weaken the currency to boost exports. Every shock hit harder, and every recovery depended on decisions made in Washington, not San Salvador. At the same time, the economy leaned heavily on remittances. More than 1/5 of the country's entire GDP came from Salvadorans working abroad and sending money home. That money kept families afloat, but the system skimmed quietly. Transfer fees drained hundreds of millions of dollars every year from one of the poorest populations in the region. The country wasn't failing because it was irresponsible. It was boxed in. Then came Nayib Bukele, young, confident, and very comfortable breaking expectations. His argument wasn't academic, it was practical. Bitcoin could lower remittance fees, attract global capital, and give El Salvador visibility it never had. More importantly, it could give the country leverage in a system where it had none. In September 2021, Bitcoin became legal tender. The price was around $45,000. Within months, it collapsed. Critics felt vindicated. Headlines declared disaster. The IMF issued warnings. Bond prices sank. Investors fled. On paper, it looked exactly like the failure everyone predicted. But here's the part that made the story uncomfortable. Bitcoin wasn't the engine of the economy, it was the signal. What the Bitcoin move really did was force attention. Tourists came, crypto entrepreneurs showed up. Foreigners who had never looked twice at El Salvador suddenly visited, invested, bought property, and spent money. Tourism grew by more than 30% in 2 years. That wasn't ideology, that was cash entering the economy. Remittance fees dropped for those who used digital wallets. Adoption wasn't universal, and daily life still ran mostly on dollars. Many people took the free Bitcoin incentive and never touched the wallet again. This was not a crypto revolution on the ground, but it was enough to change the margins. Then there's the math that gets shouted about online. Yes, El Salvador bought Bitcoin, roughly 2,300 coins. Yes, at certain points, those holdings were deeply underwater. But compared to the country's total debt, the Bitcoin position was tiny, politically loud, financially small. The real danger wasn't Bitcoin volatility, it was dollar-denominated debt coming due. And instead of accepting IMF loans with strict conditions, El Salvador waited. It refinanced, it bought back bonds at a discount, it managed timelines. In 2023, when many expected a default, it didn't happen. In 2024, Salvadoran bonds became some of the best performing emerging market assets in the world. Quietly, the narrative flipped. Bitcoin didn't save El Salvador, but it didn't destroy it either. What it did was buy time, attention, and bargaining power. That's the difference between the hype and the reality. Zooming out makes the strategy clearer. El Salvador repositioned itself from a forgotten, high-risk country into a sovereign willing to experiment when the traditional system offered no good options. That makes institutions uncomfortable, because if a small country can bend the rules and survive, then the rules start to look less absolute. There are still real risks. Bitcoin remains volatile, political power is centralized, confidence can evaporate quickly. This isn't a model every country can copy. But there's a question most critics avoid. If the traditional financial system worked so well for countries like El Salvador, why were they willing to take this risk at all? Bitcoin wasn't the solution, it was the protest. And the real lesson isn't about Bitcoin prices or charts, it's about what happens when nations decide the old financial order no longer works for them. El Salvador didn't prove Bitcoin is the future, it proved something far more unsettling. Sometimes breaking the rules is safer than following them.